Today's story is about a beautiful dream that went wrong. Everyone in the world was working together, building a wonderful tower to show how strong they were. But their great project didn't end with a crash of falling bricks. It ended with the quiet heartbreak of people not being able to understand each other anymore. So, get comfortable and let's start. Chapter 1. The City of Unity. In the heart of a sprawling valley, cradled by gentle, sun-drenched hills, stood the City of Unity, a place where every thought was shared and every dream understood. A single, harmonious language flowed through its streets and marketplaces, a river of sound that bound its people together. For young Eli, this symphony of shared words was the very music of his world. He and his best friend Maya were two notes in that grand composition, inseparable as the sun and the sky. Their days were spent in a whirlwind of imagination, chasing each other through the labyrinthine alleys, their laughter echoing off the mud brick walls. They would lie in the tall grass at the city's edge, pointing at the vast, untouchable heavens, weaving elaborate tales of the heroes and beasts that resided among the clouds. Their dreams were as boundless as the sky itself, built on the unshakable foundation of their friendship and the unified voice of their people. The city itself was a marvel of collective effort. Every structure, from the humblest dwelling to the grand central plaza, was built from the same sun-baked clay, giving the entire settlement a warm, earthen glow. The air hummed with the comfortable sounds of community, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the gentle murmur of barter in the market, the distant bleating of goats. Everyone moved with a shared purpose, a quiet confidence born from perfect understanding. Eli's father was a stonecutter, his hands rough and strong, and he would often let Eli sit and watch as he shaped raw rock into smooth, perfect blocks, each one a testament to their shared skill. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, a singular event stilled the city's constant hum. A summons rang out from the central plaza, a clear, resonant call that drew every man, woman, and child from their homes and workshops. Eli and Maya, their hands sticky from stolen dates, joined the flowing river of people, their small bodies jostled by the crowd's excited momentum. They found a spot near the front, squeezing between legs to see the raised stone platform where their leader, Zara, stood. Zara was a woman whose presence commanded silence. Her hair was streaked with silver, and her eyes held the wisdom of countless seasons. She raised her hands, and the last whispers died away, leaving a silence so profound Eli could hear the beat of his own heart. Then she spoke, her voice clear and powerful, carrying to the very edges of the gathered multitude. She spoke of their unity, their strength, their unparalleled ability to achieve anything they set their minds to. And then she unveiled her vision, a vision so grand, so audacious, that it stole the breath from the crowd. They would build a tower, not just any tower, but a structure so immense, so towering, that its peak would pierce the very floor of the heavens, a monument to their collective spirit that would allow them to touch the stars themselves. A collective gasp swept through the plaza, followed by a wave of euphoric cheers that seemed to shake the very ground. The air crackled with a new, intoxicating energy. Pride swelled in every chest, a fierce, burning pride in their city, their people, and their destiny. Eli felt it too, a thrilling jolt that ran from his head to his toes. He looked up at the endless blue, no longer an untouchable dome, but a destination. He squeezed Maya's hand, his eyes wide with wonder, already picturing himself standing at the very top, a conqueror of the sky. All around them, faces were alight with the same glorious ambition, united in a single, impossible dream. The city of unity was about to reach for eternity. Chapter 2. The Great Plan. The euphoria from Zara's announcement did not fade with the setting sun. Instead, it simmered through the city like a sustained, hopeful chord. In the days that followed, the air itself seemed charged with a new purpose. The usual rhythms of life continued, but every action, every conversation was now underscored by the grand vision of the tower. Zara stood before the people once more, this time in the great hall where plans were traditionally shared and refined. The room was packed, bodies pressed together in the warm, lantern-lit space, all eyes fixed on their leader. She unfurled a vast parchment, its edges curling, revealing intricate sketches of the proposed structure. A spiraling behemoth of stone and ambition, its apex lost in the inked clouds at the top of the page. Zara's explanation was a masterful tapestry of inspiration and engineering. She described the tower not as a mere building, but as a symbol, a physical manifestation of their unity and power. Each perfectly fitted stone would represent a family, each ascending level a generation, all bound together by their shared language and will. It would be a beacon, she proclaimed, a declaration to the heavens and the earth of what humanity could accomplish when it spoke with one voice. Her words painted a picture of a future where their city would be the center of the world, their name synonymous with greatness. The crowd listened, rapt, their collective breath held. For Eli, sitting cross-legged near the front, the plan was a siren's call. He saw not the daunting labor, but the glorious finale, the moment his hand, alongside every other hand in the city, would have helped build a stairway to the stars. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, unadulterated eagerness. He could already feel the rough texture of the stones, yearned for the moment he could add his own strength to the colossal endeavor. Later, as the evening cooled and the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Eli found Maya by their usual spot at the city's edge, where the orderly fields gave way to wild grasses. The excitement still buzzed under his skin, and he tumbled out his thoughts in a rush, describing the tower's spiraling form, the sheer scale of it, his own burning desire to be a part of it from the very first day. But Maya was quiet, her gaze fixed not on the heavens, but on the solid, familiar earth at their feet. She traced a pattern in the dirt with a stick, her brow furrowed. Where Eli saw a glorious ascent, she saw a perilous climb. Her mind, always more cautious, calculated the immense weight of the stones, the dizzying heights, the sheer, terrifying ambition of it all. She worried that their unity, so strong on the ground, might fray under the strain of such an immense task. It was not the work that frightened her, but the shadow of pride that stretched behind Zara's glorious words. They talked long into the night, their voices soft counterpoints to the chirping of crickets. Eli spoke of his hopes, the glory, the achievement, the legacy they would leave. Maya voiced her fears, the risk of overreaching, the potential for the project to consume them, to change the simple, happy balance of their lives. It was not an argument, but a quiet unspooling of two different hearts. Eli, flushed with the collective dream, could not fully comprehend her hesitation. Maya, anchored by a deep-seated prudence, could not share his unbridled fervor, yet sitting there in the starlight, their shoulders touching, they found a fragile understanding. They were both looking at the same future, but through different lenses, one focused on the radiant summit, the other wary of the long, uncertain climb. Chapter 3. Gathering Stones. The dream began to take physical form, not in the sky, but on the earth, as the entire city mobilized in a great, dusty exodus to the quarries and riverbeds. The morning air, once filled with the gentle sounds of daily life, now vibrated with the percussive rhythm of hammers striking stone and the grating slide of sledges being dragged over dry ground. A river of humanity flowed out from the city gates, a tide of determined men, women, and children, all answering Zara's call. Eli walked proudly beside his father, his small hand clutching the worn wooden handle of a gathering basket. His father's presence was a pillar of strength, his strides long and confident, his eyes already measuring the landscape for the best, most durable stones. Eli mimicked his posture, his own chest puffed out with a sense of immense importance. This was no longer a game of pretend. This was the real work of building a legend, and he was a part of it. The quarry was a scene of orchestrated chaos, a symphony of labor under the blazing sun. The cliff face echoed with the sharp, metallic clinks of chisels and the deep, resonant thuds of heavy mallets. Men, their backs glistening with sweat, worked in teams to pry great slabs of limestone from the earth's grip. Others, with practiced skill, split the larger pieces into manageable blocks. Women and older children formed long chains, passing the smaller fist-sized stones from hand to hand, their movements fluid and efficient, creating a living conveyor belt that stretched all the way back to the growing stockpiles near the city walls. The air was thick with the smell of crushed rock and damp earth, and a fine white dust coated everything, turning hair and skin a pale, ghostly gray. Eli worked tirelessly, his small arms straining as he helped his father load their sledge. He focused on finding stones with flat, even sides, just as his father had taught him, each one a perfect piece of the grand puzzle. Every time he added a stone to the pile, he felt a jolt of accomplishment, a tangible connection to the soaring spire of his dreams. From a small rocky outcrop overlooking the bustling activity, Maya watched. She had come with her family, but the fervent energy of the crowd felt overwhelming, a force that pushed her to the periphery. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, observing the scene below. She saw Eli, his face smudged with dirt and alight with a fierce joy as his father clapped him on the back, a gesture of approval that made the boy stand even taller. She saw the unity Zara had promised, the seamless cooperation, the shared laughter that punctuated the hard work, the way everyone moved as a single, determined organism. But from her vantage point, the excitement felt like a distant, roaring fire from which she was separated by an invisible pane of glass. The pride that animated every face seemed to her a blinding light, and her own quiet worries felt like a solitary, shrinking shadow. She was not against the tower, not exactly, but she felt disconnected from the collective fervor, a single, still note in a crashing crescendo of ambition. She saw Eli fully immersed in the common purpose, and a lonely ache settled in her chest, the first small crack in the foundation of their friendship, unnoticed by all in the glorious, dusty haze of the gathering. Chapter 4. First bricks. The day the first stone was laid, the city held its breath. A palpable energy, thick as summer humidity, hung over the central plaza where the ground had been painstakingly leveled and marked for the tower's immense foundation. Every soul from the city of unity had gathered, forming a vast, silent circle around the sacred space. Leader Zara stood at the center, her figure austere and commanding against the raw earth. In her hands, she cradled not a tool, but a single perfect brick, its surface smoothed by the river and blessed by the sun. This was no ordinary building block. It was a promise, the physical seed from which their celestial ambition would grow. As the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, Zara knelt. With a reverence usually reserved for prayer, she placed the brick into the waiting earth, setting it into a bed of wet mortar, mixed with sacred herbs. A collective sigh, a release of held breath and pent-up hope, rippled through the crowd. Then the silence shattered into a roar of celebration. Drums beat a frantic, joyful rhythm, flutes trilled, and voices rose in a unified song of triumph. The great work had truly begun. In the days that followed, the ceremonial solemnity gave way to the gritty reality of construction. The foundation trench became a hive of relentless activity, swarming with workers whose movements were initially a beautiful, synchronized dance. Eli, granted the honor of working alongside the master builders for the foundational layers, felt a profound sense of belonging. His hands, now calloused and strong, learned the satisfying heft of a trowel, the precise angle needed to spread the mortar, the gentle tap of the level that confirmed a stone was true. He worked shoulder to shoulder with his friends, their laughter and shared grunts of effort weaving a strong fabric of camaraderie. For a few glorious days, it seemed Zara's vision was infallible. The unity was not just an idea. It was in the dust on their skin and the synchronized rhythm of their labor. The first few courses of stone rose from the ground, a perfect, growing square that was the talk of the entire city. But as the foundation widened and the teams grew larger, the seamless harmony began to develop its first faint, dissonant notes. The first argument was a small thing, a spark in the dry tinder of collective will. It started between two teams of masons working on opposite corners of the foundation. One group, led by Eli's father, advocated for a traditional interlocking pattern of stones, a method proven for its stability over generations. The other, a younger, more ambitious crew, championed a newer, faster technique that used larger, fewer stones, believing it would accelerate their ascent to the heavens. At first, it was a respectful debate, a clash of ideas over the evening fires. But soon, the disagreement hardened. The traditionalists saw the new method as reckless, a dangerous shortcut that compromised the tower's very soul. The innovators saw the old ways as sluggish, a chain holding back their destiny. Eli found himself caught in the middle, his loyalty to his father warring with the infectious excitement of the younger builders. He watched as a friendly competition curdled into stubborn rivalry. A shared water jug was passed with less generosity. A helpful hand was slower to be offered. The unified language they all spoke now carried sharp-edged words of criticism and impatience. The beautiful, synchronized dance of construction faltered, replaced by occasional jostling and muttered complaints. The cracks were not yet in the stone, but in the spirit of the builders. Eli looked across the worksite and saw Maya watching from her usual distant spot, her expression unreadable. He felt a pang of something complex, a mix of pride in the rising stones and a creeping unease that the perfect unity he had always known was, for the first time, showing its fragile seams. The first bricks were laid, but the first doubts had been seeded, growing silently in the shadow of their soaring ambition. Chapter 5. Rising Higher. The tower's ascent became the city's new heartbeat, a relentless pulse of ambition that measured the passing days. Each sunrise revealed a new layer of stone, another ring added to the spiraling giant that now cast a long, creeping shadow across the eastern districts. The air, once filled with the simple scents of baking bread and blooming herbs, now carried the constant, gritty taste of pulverized rock and the sharp tang of fresh mortar. Ropes and wooden scaffolds crisscrossed the growing structure like a giant's web, with teams of workers clinging to its sides, their figures growing smaller and more precarious with every new level. Eli, his youthful energy seemingly boundless, threw himself into the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He learned to scale the ladders with a sure-footed confidence, his hands growing as rough and tough as the stones he carried. The higher he climbed, the more intoxicating the view became. The city of unity sprawled below him like a beautiful, intricate toy, and the sky, once a distant ceiling, now felt like a destination within his grasp. He could almost feel the cool mist of the clouds on his face. It was on one of these dizzying heights that the fragile peace between him and Maya finally shattered. She had sought him out, climbing the network of ladders with a cautious determination that set her apart from the swarming, confident builders. She found him on a broad ledge high above the world, helping to position a massive block of limestone. The wind whipped at their clothes, a constant whispering reminder of their vulnerability. Maya's face was pale, her eyes wide not with wonder, but with a deep, gnawing fear. She pointed out towards the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather, a distant threat. Her hands gestured at the scaffolding, at the way it groaned and shifted under the workers' weight, at the lack of safety ropes for those on the highest levels. She tried to convey her terror, her conviction that they were building too high, too fast, that their ambition was blinding them to the very real dangers that swayed and creaked beneath their feet. But Eli, flushed with the thrill of altitude and the approving nods from the master builders, saw her concern not as a warning, but as an anchor trying to drag him back to the ground. The wind stole her quiet, earnest words, and the intoxicating roar of progress drowned out her plea for caution. He shook his head, a gesture of dismissal that was as sharp as a slap. He pointed upward, toward the next unfinished level, his expression one of impatient fervor. He could not, would not, hear her fears. To him, they were the whispers of the past, holding back the glorious future. The gulf between them, which had been a quiet, manageable stream, suddenly yawned into a chasm. Maya's face fell, the last flicker of hope in her eyes extinguished. Without another word, she turned and began the long, careful descent, leaving Eli alone with the wind and his pride. The silence that fell between them was heavier than any stone. In the days that followed, they moved through the same city, breathed the same dusty air, but inhabited entirely separate worlds. Eli threw himself even deeper into his work, the physical exhaustion a welcome distraction from the cold knot of guilt that had taken root in his stomach. He would see Maya across the plaza, her head bowed, always walking away from the tower, never toward it. The joy he had once found in the climb was now tinged with a bitter aftertaste. The triumphant shouts of his fellow workers sounded hollow in his ears. He had chosen the soaring spire over his oldest friend, and with every new stone laid, he felt the weight of that choice pressed down on him, a burden far greater than any block of limestone. The tower rose higher, a monument to their unity, but for Eli, its shadow now seemed to fall directly on the broken friendship at its feet. Chapter 6. Whispers of Worry. The fracture between Eli and Maya became a subtle crack in the city's foundation, a quiet fault line running through the bustling, dust-choked air. As the tower stretched ever skyward, its shadow no longer just a marker of time, but a looming, tangible presence. The first whispers of dissent began to circulate. They started in the hushed corners of homes, in the quiet moments between the hammer falls, carried on the same wind that made the high scaffolds groan. Maya's family, long known for their quiet pragmatism, became the reluctant voice of this growing unease. Her father, a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured timber, was heard expressing his concerns to a neighbor. He spoke not of defiance, but of prudence, questioning the relentless push upward, the ever-thinning margins of safety, the way the very ground seemed to tremble with the tower's growing weight. His wife, Maya's mother, echoed these fears, her eyes constantly drawn to the dizzying heights where her daughter had once tried to reason with a friend now lost to ambition. These whispers, once isolated, began to find other receptive ears. The baker, whose ovens were now perpetually coated in a fine white powder, wondered aloud if the stones for their daily bread were being sacrificed for the stones of the sky. The weaver, whose vibrant threads were now perpetually dulled by grit, murmured that a tower that touched the clouds would cast the city below into perpetual shadow. The initial unified fervor was slowly being leached away, replaced by a low, humming anxiety that was felt more than heard. People still worked, their movements practiced and strong, but the joyful songs that had once accompanied their labor were now often replaced by a weary silence. They looked at the soaring structure, not just with pride, but with a new, creeping apprehension, as if they were nurturing a beautiful but unpredictable beast that was growing beyond their control. Leader Zara, sensing the shift in the city's spirit as a sailor senses a change in the wind, addressed the people from the base of her magnificent creation. She stood before them, her figure silhouetted against the immense stone spine of the tower, her voice still ringing with the same powerful conviction that had first launched the dream. She acknowledged the whispers, not with anger, but with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if brushing away a trivial annoyance. She called the worries the natural tremors of a small-minded earth, trying to cling to those who dared to dream of the heavens. Her eyes, burning with an unwavering fire, swept over the crowd, challenging the doubters. She spoke of stars not as distant, cold points of light, but as jewels waiting to be claimed, of a destiny that demanded courage, not caution. The tower was not too proud, she insisted. Their ambitions had simply not yet grown tall enough to match it. They must not listen to the fearful voices from the ground, she proclaimed, but to the glorious silence of the sky that called them ever upward. Her words were a potent antidote to the spreading doubt, and a visible ripple of restored resolve passed through many in the crowd. Shoulders straightened, determined nods were exchanged. The familiar intoxication of the grand dream surged back, drowning out the quieter, more sensible fears. Eli, listening from his place among the builders, felt the guilt and conflict within him subside, soothed by Zara's absolute certainty. He looked at the tower, its peak now scratching at the underbelly of the passing clouds, and felt his own doubts scatter like mist. Maya's warnings seemed small and earthbound in the face of such a magnificent destiny. He watched as the dissenters, including Maya's family, fell silent, their worried expressions masked by the collective will. The whispers were stifled, but not silenced. They retreated into the heart of the city, into the foundations of homes, waiting. The work continued, the clang of hammers and the grind of stone filling the air once more, a loud, proud noise that tried its best to cover the soft, persistent sound of worry that still echoed, if one listened closely enough, in the spaces between the stones. Chapter 7. The Peak of Pride. The tower now stood as a colossus of human ambition, its peak so high it seemed to comb the very clouds, catching tatters of mist on its sun-warmed stones. From its dizzying summit, the world below was transformed into a map of miniature wonders. The city of unity, a mere geometric pattern of baked earth, the river a silver thread, the people themselves like scattered grains of sand. The air at such a height was thin and cold, carrying a profound silence that felt both sacred and terrifying. To mark this impossible achievement, leader Zara declared a citywide celebration, a festival of triumph that would eclipse all others. The plaza at the tower's base, once a site of focused labor, was transformed into a sea of revelry. Great braziers were lit, casting a dancing orange glow that fought back the twilight, their smoke carrying the rich scents of roasting meats and spiced wines. Musicians played with frantic joy, their melodies weaving through the laughter and shouts of the crowd. People danced with an abandon born of shared victory, their faces flushed with pride and the intoxicating belief that they had, through sheer collective will, conquered the very sky. Eli moved through the throng, the celebration a roaring tide around him. He accepted the claps on his back and the cups of sweet drink pressed into his hands, his own face fixed in a smile that felt as rigid as the stones he had helped set. He looked up at the tower, its immense form black against the deepening violet of the evening sky, and felt a surge of the old, pure awe. This was what they had dreamed of, what they had blistered their hands for. He had helped build this. Yet, as he scanned the jubilant faces, the laughing mouths, the eyes bright with firelight and triumph, he was searching for one person, one face that he knew with a sinking certainty would not be there. He looked for Maya's quiet, watchful eyes, for her thoughtful expression amidst the chaos of joy. He searched the edges of the crowd, the shadows between the braziers, the doorways of homes facing away from the tower, but she was nowhere to be found. Her absence was a cold, hollow space in the heart of the warmth, a silent note of dissent in the roaring symphony of pride. The memory of their argument on the high ledge returned to him with the force of a physical blow. He saw again the fear in her eyes, so stark and genuine, and his own dismissive gesture, his impatience to return to the work. He had chosen the cold, hard certainty of stone over the soft, complicated truth of her friendship. The celebratory music now sounded shrill to his ears. The laughter felt forced and brittle. The peak of their achievement, this moment of ultimate pride, felt strangely empty. He had reached for the heavens, but in doing so, he had let go of the one person who had always kept him grounded. The tower stood as a monument to their unity, but for Eli, standing alone in the crowd, it also stood as a monument to his own failure, a piercing loneliness that reached even higher than the cloud-touched stones. Chapter 8. The storm approaches. The celebration's embers had barely cooled before the sky began to change. The morning after the festival dawned not with the clear, hopeful light the city had grown accustomed to, but with a strange, bruised yellow hue that stained the horizon. The air, usually dry and filled with dust, grew thick and heavy, clinging to the skin like a damp cloth. The wind, once a playful companion that tugged at cloaks and banners, now carried a new voice, a low, mournful moan that wound through the streets, whispering of a shift in the world's mood. High above, the clouds were no longer the soft white puffs that had brushed the tower's peak, but a churning, slate-gray army marching slowly and inexorably toward the city. They gathered in deep, ominous rows, their undersides bruised with purple and black, swallowing the sun and casting the city of unity into a premature, eerie twilight. The shadow of the tower, once a symbol of progress, now lay across the city like a dark, accusing finger. With the changing weather came a new kind of whisper, one that slithered through the city faster than the creeping gloom. It started in the market, where a trader, his eyes wide with superstitious fear, claimed to have seen a face of pure lightning in the clouds. A water-bearer, her voice trembling, spoke of hearing a deep, resonant growl from the heavens that was nothing like thunder. The rumors fed on the collective anxiety, growing more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. The tower, they murmured, had not been an act of unity, but of defiance. They had not reached for the stars. They had trespassed on a divine domain. The gathering storm was not a natural phenomenon, but a manifestation of celestial anger, a brewing punishment for their monumental pride. The very air seemed to crackle with a sense of impending judgment, and the unified language of the people now carried frantic, fearful questions for which there were no answers. Eli felt the shift in the city's soul like a physical chill. The guilt that had festered in him since his fight with Maya now crystallized into a desperate, urgent need. The approaching storm, with its divine connotations, made their petty argument feel like a catastrophic failure. He had to find her. He had to apologize, to bridge the chasm he had created before it was too late, before the sky itself fell upon them. He began to push through the crowded streets, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The city, usually a place of orderly movement, was descending into a chaotic swirl of panic. People rushed in every direction, their faces etched with fear, some heading for the perceived safety of their homes, others gathering in frightened clusters, pointing at the darkening sky. Eli dodged through the throng, his eyes scanning desperately for a glimpse of Maya's familiar form. Her simple tunic, the way she wore her hair, her quiet, observant posture. He ran to all their old spots, the grassy knoll at the city's edge, now whipped by the rising wind, the quiet alley where they used to share secrets, the steps of the granary where they would watch the sunset. She was nowhere. He pushed his way to her family's dwelling, his knuckles rapping urgently on the wooden door, but it was barred shut, and no answer came from within. He called her name, but his voice was lost in the growing cacophony of the frightened city, the shouts of alarm, the crying of children, the frantic bleating of penned animals. The crowd was a living, surging entity, a sea of bodies that closed ranks and flowed around him, making a systematic search impossible. Every face he saw was a stranger, every shape that might have been hers dissolved into the anonymous mass as he drew nearer. The storm clouds lowered, pressing down on the city, and the first cold drops of rain began to fall, stinging his face. He was alone, utterly and completely, swallowed by the crowd he had once felt so much a part of, his apology dying unspoken in his throat as the heavens prepared to break. Chapter 9. The Moment of Confusion. The first drop of rain was a cold, shocking pinprick on Eli's cheek, a herald of the deluge to come. He stood frozen in the seething heart of the panicked crowd, his search for Maya rendered impossible by the tide of bodies. Then, as if the sky had been holding its breath, the strange, heavy silence shattered. But it was not the crack of thunder that broke it. It was a sound far more terrifying, a sound that unwove the very fabric of their world. A woman near Eli opened her mouth to scream a warning to her child, but what emerged was not the familiar melodic language of their city. It was a guttural, sharp-clipped torrent of unknown syllables, a sound as alien and jarring as grinding stones. The child stared, its own cry dying in its throat, replaced by a high, warbling series of notes that belonged to no tongue Eli had ever heard. For a single, suspended heartbeat, there was only the bewildering cacophony of 1,000 voices all speaking at once, and none of them making any sense. The wind seemed to snatch the words from their mouths and twist them into nonsense. A man who had been shouting orders to take cover was now bellowing a string of sibilant, hissing vowels. A friend trying to calm another spat out a rhythmic, chanting dialect. Eli's own mind screamed Maya's name, but when he opened his mouth to call for her, the sound that ripped from his throat was a coarse, barking exclamation that horrified him. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the chaos was internal, a prison of incomprehension. The shared river of language that had flowed through their city for generations had, in an instant, exploded into 1,000,000 disparate, conflicting streams. Panic, which had been a simmering fear, now erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. The crowd, once united by a common purpose and a common tongue, disintegrated into a maelstrom of isolated, terrified individuals. A man gestured wildly toward the tower, his face a mask of frantic explanation, but the sounds he made were a furious, gurgling rush to the woman beside. Him! She recoiled, hearing not a plea for reason, but a threat, and shoved him back, her own retort a series of sharp, bird-like chirps. The shove turned into a struggle. All around, the same scene repeated itself. A simple, desperate grab for a loved one's hand was misinterpreted as an attack. A warning cry about a collapsing awning sounded like a curse. The beautiful, unified language that had built the tower had become a weapon of total confusion, turning cooperation into conflict and friends into frightening strangers. The city of unity was gone, replaced by a babel of terrified, isolated souls, each trapped in the solitary confinement of their own suddenly alien tongue as the storm finally broke overhead. Chapter 10. lost in the noise. The world had become a roaring sea of meaningless sound, a cacophony that battered Eli's senses and stripped his thoughts bare. The cold rain began to fall in earnest, thick, heavy drops that plastered his hair to his forehead and soaked through his tunic. But the physical discomfort was a distant echo compared to the psychological torment. He stumbled through the churning crowd, his own voice a traitor in his throat. He tried to call for Maya again, pushing the intention with all his might, but what erupted was another burst of that same harsh, guttural language, a foreign bark lost instantly in the storm of other alien tongues. The words felt like gravel in his mouth, ugly and wrong. He saw his own confusion mirrored on 1,000 faces around him, eyes wide with terror, mouths working frantically, producing only gibberish. A language that had been the bedrock of his existence, the medium of every dream and friendship, had been wiped away, leaving behind a terrifying, senseless void. He saw a mother clutching her young son, her mouth forming what were clearly words of comfort, her hand stroking his hair. But the sounds that came out were a rapid, clicking staccato, and the boy flinched as if struck, wailing back in a high, whining dialect that held no trace of recognition. The mother's face crumpled, a mask of utter devastation as the most fundamental connection of all, that between parent and child, was severed by the invisible wall of sound. A few paces away, an elderly couple who had walked through life hand in hand for decades now stared at each other in bewildered horror. The man spoke, his voice trembling with a lifetime of shared tenderness, but the words were a fluid melodic string of nonsense. The woman shook her head, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks, unable to comprehend the stranger her beloved husband had become. Families, the very heart of the city, were being torn apart not by distance, but by an impenetrable auditory fog. They reached for each other, their gestures desperate and universal, but their pleas were just noise, their reassurances were threats, their love was silence. A deep, primal fear, colder than the rain, seized Eli. This was not the simple chaos of a panicked crowd. This was the end of the world as he knew it. The unity that had built the tower, the shared laughter with Maya, the comforting voice of his father, all of it had been built on the foundation of a common language. That foundation had not just cracked, it had vaporized. He was alone, truly and utterly alone, in a city of thousands. The towering structure they had built with such pride now seemed like a monstrous joke, a monument to a harmony that no longer existed. The ambition to touch the heavens had somehow shattered their ability to speak to each other on earth. He pressed his back against the rough wall of a building, sliding down into the mud as the crowd jostled past him. A river of shouting, weeping, incomprehensible strangers. He was lost, not in the city, but in the noise, a single, silent scream trapped in a roaring, meaningless universe. The fear was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs as he realized that even if Maya were standing right in front of him, he would have no way to call her name, and she would have no way to answer. Chapter 11. The scattering begins. The chaos did not subside with the passing of the storm. It merely hardened into a new, desperate reality. The initial blind panic that had seized the city in the grip of the divine confusion slowly gave way to a grim, practical terror. The rain had washed the dust from the air, leaving the world sharp and clear, but the people within it remained shrouded in a fog of mutual incomprehension. The great plaza, once the heart of their unity, was now a fractured landscape of isolated groups. The instinct for survival, more ancient than any language, began to assert itself. People drifted together not by family or friendship. Those bonds were now linguistically severed, but by the sheer accidental similarity of the strange new sounds falling from their mouths. A man would shout in a series of sharp staccato barks, and another, hearing a familiar rhythm in the noise, would gravitate toward him, their faces etched with a wary relief. A woman singing a low, mournful tune would find herself joined by others whose voices carried the same melodic lilt, a fragile island of understanding in a sea of Babel. Eli watched this grim sorting from the periphery, his own harsh, guttural tongue feeling like a brand that marked him as an outsider to most. He saw a cluster of people who spoke in soft, sibilant whispers, gathered near the dry fountain, their gestures fluid and coordinated as they began to gather supplies from abandoned stalls. Another group, whose communication was a series of rhythmic hand claps and guttural chants, started to dismantle a temporary shelter for its wooden poles, their movements efficient and unified. These were not celebrations of new-found community. They were acts of stark necessity. The shared dream of the tower was a ghost. The only dream now was survival, and survival required being able to understand the person standing next to you. The arguments over building techniques and the fears of overreaching ambition were luxuries of a lost world. Now, the debates were silent, fought with eyes and gestures over a water skin or a loaf of bread, and the only ambition was to find a place where the sky would not fall on them again. The decision to leave was not a single proclamation. There was no one left who could be understood by all, but a collective, dawning understanding that passed through each newly formed linguistic tribe like a shudder. The city was cursed. The great tower, their pride, now stood as a grim monument to their folly, its shadow a cold reminder of the unity they had shattered. One by one, the groups began to move. The soft speakers shouldered their meager bundles and moved westward, toward the setting sun and the rumored green valleys beyond. The chanters, with their salvaged poles and determined eyes, turned north, following the course of the river. Others looked south, toward the distant mountains, or east into the vast unknown plains. There were no farewells between the groups, only silent, wary glances. The common language of gesture was now reserved for threats and warnings, a raised hand, a shaken head, a pointed finger away from the city. The exodus was a quiet, mournful procession, the exact opposite of the joyous, unified mobilization that had begun the tower. They had arrived at the city as one people, speaking one tongue. They were leaving as many, carrying the seeds of future nations and future wars in their incompatible words, scattering like leaves before a cold, divine wind. Chapter 12. Searching for a friend, the eastern road stretched before them, a pale ribbon of packed earth unraveling into the vast, unknown plains. Eli walked within the heart of his new group, a collection of people bound together by the harsh, guttural tongue that had so horrified him when it first tore from his own throat. They moved with a grim, shared purpose, a caravan of survivalists whose only common ground was the accidental similarity of their speech. The rhythm of their march was a new, unfamiliar language in itself. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the soft clatter of carried possessions, the occasional sharp command from the man who had emerged as their de facto leader. Eli kept pace, his young legs strong, but his spirit felt heavy as stone. With every step that carried him farther from the city of unity, his head turned, his eyes perpetually scanning the receding horizon behind them. He was not looking at the cursed tower, its silhouette now a dark broken tooth against the sky. He was searching for a single familiar shape, a flash of a simple tunic, a glimpse of dark hair, any sign that Maya had also turned east. The landscape around them was beautiful in a way that felt cruel and indifferent. The rising sun painted the grasslands in shades of gold and green, and a soft breeze whispered through the tall stalks, carrying the scent of wild thyme and damp soil. But the beauty was lost on Eli. To him, the open plains were not a promise of a new beginning, but a yawning emptiness, a physical manifestation of the loneliness that had taken root in his chest. The conversations around him, conducted in their new choppy language, were a constant reminder of his isolation. He understood the words for water, for rest, for danger, but they were just sounds, devoid of the warmth and history that had lived in every syllable of his native tongue. He missed the musical lilt of Maya's voice, the way she would say his name, the shared, unspoken understanding that had existed between them long before the tower had ever been dreamed of. That connection had been a home more solid than any dwelling, and now he was exiled from it, homeless in every way that mattered. As the day wore on and the city vanished completely behind the gentle roll of the hills, a profound sense of desolation settled over him. The group stopped by a small meandering stream to refill their waterskins and rest. Eli sat apart from the others on a flat, sun-warmed rock near the water's edge. He watched the strangers who were now his only community. A woman comforting a crying child with cooing, unfamiliar words, two men pointing and arguing over the best path forward. They were building the fragile foundations of a new tribe, but Eli felt no part of it. His heart was a compass needle stubbornly pointing west, back toward the ruins of everything he had known, back toward his friend. He pictured Maya alone, scared, her quiet nature making her vulnerable in the brutal new world of confusion and scattered groups. He remembered the hurt in her eyes on the high ledge, the finality of her turn away from him. The memory was a physical ache, a sharper pain than any hunger or thirst. He was traveling east with a band of survivors, moving toward an uncertain future, but with every step he left a piece of himself behind on the western road, lost and searching for a friend he feared he would never see again. Chapter 13. New Words, New World. The harsh, guttural language that had once felt like a curse began to soften around the edges, its sharp angles worn down by the relentless rhythm of travel and shared necessity. Eli's group, a band of accidental linguists bound by the common sounds that fell from their mouths, moved like a single organism across the undulating plains. At first, their communication had been a series of crude, frantic gestures and the few dozen words they had collectively deciphered, pointing for direction, grunting for affirmation, hissing for danger. But as days bled into weeks, the crude sounds began to accrue meaning, layering themselves into a fragile new tongue. The word for sun became a warm, open-mouthed exhalation that mirrored the feeling of its light on their faces. The word for river was a flowing, liquid sound that evoked its cool, life-giving current. They developed a shared vocabulary for hunger, for fatigue, for the sight of distant birds that might signal water. It was a language born not of poetry or story, but of survival, each new term a tool carved from the raw timber of their circumstance. Eli learned this new language with the desperate focus of a drowning man learning to swim. His mind, once filled with the soaring dreams of the tower and the gentle cadence of his old life, now became a meticulous ledger for these foreign sounds. He listened intently to the exchanges around the evening fires, his lips moving silently, practicing the unfamiliar formations. He learned to ask for a share of the roasted tubers they dug from the earth, to warn of a fissure in the ground, to express the simple, profound relief of a full waterskin. The act of speaking became a conscious effort, a series of deliberate muscular commands where once it had been an unconscious flow. There were small victories, the first time he successfully conveyed a sighting of game, the nod of understanding from the group's leader, that felt like monumental achievements. He was building a new bridge across the chasm of silence, one rough-hewn, functional word at a time. Yet, with every new word mastered, a ghost whispered the old ones in his memory. Lying in his bedroll at night, staring at the cold, indifferent stars, he would feel the shape of his lost language on his tongue. He would silently form the words for friend, for dream, for Maya, and the silence that answered was a deeper emptiness than any the plains could offer. This new language was a practical tool, a key to survival, but it had no room for the things that had once given his life meaning. It could not articulate the specific shade of the sky at dusk over the city of unity, or the sound of shared laughter, or the complex ache of regret. He could now speak to his new companions about the necessities of life. But he was more alone than ever in the landscape of his own heart. The unity they were forging was a pragmatic alliance, a shield against the wilderness. It was a stark, utilitarian world they were building with their new words, a world that had no vocabulary for the beautiful, broken world they had left behind. Chapter 14, the first argument. The thirst was a dry, cracking presence in their throats, a shared agony that needed no translation. For days, Eli's group had pushed eastward across the sun-scorched plains, their waterskins shrinking from plump to pathetic leathery sacks. The landscape had turned cruel, the vibrant greens fading to a brittle, dusty yellow, the earth cracking into a mosaic of parched desire. Hope became a physical sensation tied to the sight of anything green on the horizon. When they finally crested a low, rocky ridge and saw the thin, silver gleam of a stream winding through a shallow gully below, a collective, rasping sigh of relief passed through them. It was more than water. It was a reprieve, a promise of continued life. They scrambled down the crumbling slope with a renewed, desperate energy, their harsh, guttural language erupting in sharp, joyful exclamations at the prospect of cool, clear water. But their hope curdled into cold shock as they reached the gully's edge. Another group was already there. They had emerged from the opposite direction, a band of people just as travel-worn and desperate, crouched at the water's edge, drinking deeply and refilling their own containers. For a moment, there was only the sound of the gurgling stream and the heavy, wary silence between the two tribes. Then the leader of Eli's group stepped forward, his hand raised not in greeting, but in a gesture of halting command. He spoke, his voice a series of the now familiar barks and grunts, pointing first to his own people, then to the stream, his meaning clear. This water is ours. We claim it. The other group's leader, a woman with fierce eyes and a weathered face, stood up slowly. She replied, her voice a fluid, melodic cascade of sound completely alien to Eli's ears. She swept her arm in a wide arc, encompassing her own people in the stream, her tone firm and unyielding. Her meaning was just as clear. We were here first. The water is ours. The two leaders stood facing each other, a few paces of dusty earth between them, their bodies taut with tension. They tried again, their voices rising, layering argument upon argument in two utterly incompatible languages. The harsh, choppy barks of Eli's leader clashed violently with the smooth, singing vowels of the woman, creating a dissonant symphony of mutual incomprehension. Hands gestured, pointing, demanding, dismissing. Faces, which might have once been capable of friendly negotiation, were now set in masks of stubborn defiance. The universal language of thirst had brought them to the same place, but the curse of Babel turned that shared need into the seed of conflict. The misunderstanding deepened, fermented by fear and desperation. A man from Eli's group, his thirst overriding his caution, took a step toward the water. A man from the other group misinterpreted the movement as an aggressive advance and sprang forward, shoving him back with a guttural shout. It was the spark. The shove was answered with a furious snarl. Another man from Eli's side lunged, and suddenly the two groups were not just shouting at each other, but colliding. It was not a battle of armies, but a chaotic, brutal scramble, a messy explosion of pent-up fear and frustration. Fists flew, not with skill, but with blind rage. A waterskin was torn, its precious contents spilling uselessly into the thirsty ground. A woman screamed, a high, piercing sound of terror that needed no translation. Eli found himself pushed to the front, his own heart hammering, his hands balling into fists as a stranger with wild eyes came at him. He saw not an individual, but a threat, an obstacle between him and the water that meant survival. The fight was short, ugly, and decisive. Eli's group, larger and more desperate, managed to drive the other back, their melodic shouts of anger and pain fading as they retreated up the far side of the gully, casting hateful glances behind them. The stream was theirs. They had won. But as Eli stood panting, the coppery taste of fear in his mouth, looking at the scattered, bruised members of his own group and the last glimpse of their fleeing rivals, he felt no victory. He felt only a cold, sinking dread. The first drops of blood had been spilled not over ideology or pride, but over the simple, essential need for water, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the stream ever could, that it would not be the last. Chapter 15, Memories of Babel. The dream was a perfect sun-drenched tapestry woven from the golden threads of a lost world. In the landscape of his sleep, Eli was a boy again, his hands clean, his heart light. The city of unity sprawled around him, not as a cursed ruin, but as a living, breathing being, its streets humming with the single, harmonious language that was the music of his soul. He stood with Maya in their favorite spot at the city's edge, the tall grass tickling their legs, the sky a vast, untroubled blue above them. There was no tower, no shadow of ambition, only the simple, profound joy of a shared understanding. He could hear the cadence of her voice, the specific lilt she used when she was about to share a secret, the warm, familiar sound of his own name on her lips. They were building a tiny fort of pebbles. their heads close together, their laughter a single clear note in the quiet afternoon. The dream was so vivid he could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, smell the scent of baking bread from a nearby dwelling, feel the unshakable certainty that this world, this friendship, was eternal. He awoke to the gray light of a plain's dawn, the dream's warmth evaporating like mist, leaving behind the cold, hard bed of reality. The familiar ache of loss settled in his chest, a heavy stone where his heart should be. Around him, the members of his new tribe were stirring, their movements and the harsh guttural sounds of their waking a constant reminder of the fractured world he now inhabited. The faces were familiar, but the language was a wall between him and the ghosts of his past. He lay still for a long moment, clinging to the fading echoes of the dream, the sound of Maya's laughter, the feeling of perfect belonging. The transition from that vibrant memory to the muted, pragmatic reality of his existence was a small death every morning. A profound sadness, deeper than mere loneliness, washed over him. He had not just lost a city or a friend, he had lost the very medium in which his happiest memories were stored, the language that had given them color and sound. Later that day, as the group rested in the shade of a rocky outcrop, the children of the tribe, born into this world of confusion or too young to firmly remember the old one, gathered near him. They were a quiet, solemn bunch, their eyes old with a wisdom they should not possess. One of them, a little girl with wide, curious eyes, pointed a grubby finger back in the direction from which they had come, her brow furrowed in a question she lacked the words to ask. Eli understood. She was asking about the past, about the stories that haunted the adults' eyes. He looked at their expectant faces and felt a duty, a need to bridge the chasm between the world that was and the world that is. He sat them down, and using a combination of their new, rough-hewn words and a language of gesture more ancient than any tongue, he began to tell them a story. He swept his arm across the horizon, painting a picture of a great city, not of scattered tribes, but of one people. He stacked his hands one atop the other, higher and higher, his eyes lifting to the sky, showing them the tower not as a symbol of folly, but as a testament to what they could achieve when every voice sang the same song. He spoke of the stones that fit together like a perfect puzzle, of the celebrations that shook the ground, of a time when a word of comfort was always understood and a call for a friend was always answered. He could not give them the specific words, the names, the intricate melodies of his old life, but he could give them the shape of the dream. He showed them the unity, the ambition, the breathtaking beauty of their old home. He told them of Babel, not as a curse, but as a memory of a greatness they had once possessed, a story of a shining singular world that existed now only in the hushed tones of storytellers and the aching hearts of those who remembered, a world forever lost in the silent, sorrowful space between his old words and his new. Chapter 16. Building a new home. The valley was a cupped hand of fertile earth, sheltered by gentle wooded slopes and blessed with a clear, swift flowing river that carved a silver path through its heart. After the endless, dusty miles of the plains, it felt like a promise fulfilled, a sanctuary wrested from the jaws of the wilderness. The decision to stop was not announced with speeches or ceremonies. It was a quiet, collective understanding that passed through Eli's group As they stood at the valley's edge, looking down upon the lush green and hearing the soothing murmur of the water, the weary slump of their shoulders straightened, and a new kind of energy, one of purpose rather than flight, began to animate their movements. The time for wandering was over. The time for building had begun again, but this time their ambition was not aimed at the heavens, but at the solid, forgiving ground beneath their feet. Work commenced with a grim, determined efficiency. The harsh, guttural language they shared was now a tool for coordination, its sharp commands perfectly suited for the tasks at hand. Teams were organized with silent nods and pointed fingers. The strongest men went to the forest's edge, their axes biting into the trunks of straight, tall pines with a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoed through the valley. The felled trees were stripped of their branches and dragged to the chosen building site, their raw, sappy scent filling the air. Others, Eli among them, began digging foundation trenches, their shovels sinking into the dark, rich loam. Women and children gathered stones from the riverbed, smooth and water-worn, perfect for lighting hearths and reinforcing walls. A communal kiln was hastily constructed, and soon the sharp, mineral smell of baking clay joined the symphony of scents as they began producing the bricks that would form the walls of their new dwellings. It was a different kind of construction than the tower, humble, horizontal, and deeply rooted. There were no grand designs sketched on parchment, only the practical need for shelter, for storage, for a place to lay their heads that was truly theirs. Eli worked with a relentless physicality, his young muscles powering through the labor of digging, lifting, and hauling. The sheer exertion was a welcome anesthetic, a way to silence the constant whispering thoughts in his head. He focused on the tangible, the satisfying weight of a stone in his hands, the precise fit of a log into a notch, the growing outline of a wall against the sky. But as he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, his eyes would inevitably drift from the emerging structures to the vast, empty sky above the valley's rim. His hands, calloused and dirty, remembered a different texture, the smooth, sun-warmed face of a limestone block destined for the clouds. The sight of a straight, tall tree being shaped into a roof beam would trigger a memory of a dizzying scaffold, of a city spread out beneath him like a dream. He was building a new home, hammering together a future from wood and stone, but his mind was a ruin, haunted by the ghost of a different colossal home that had reached for the stars. Each log set in place, each stone mortared into a wall, felt like a surrender, an acceptance of a smaller, earthbound world. He was helping to create a community, a place of safety and belonging. But with every wall that rose, he was also building a monument to everything that had been lost when the sky itself had spoken a single devastating word, and the tower of their dreams had become the tomb of their unity. Chapter 17, Different Paths. The great scattering from Babel was not a single event, but a slow, inexorable branching, a river of humanity dividing into countless smaller streams, each carving its own course through the uncharted wilderness. While Eli's group had turned their faces eastward, finding their refuge in the sheltered valley, other linguistic tribes bound by their own accidental tongues ventured forth in every direction, guided by the silent logic of survival and the faint, fading memory of a shared origin. They moved like spores on a divine wind, carrying within them the seeds of future cultures, their paths diverging until the world itself seemed to stretch and expand to accommodate their separation. To the north, a tribe whose language was a series of soft, sibilant whispers and complex hand gestures found their way into a land of ancient, mist-shrouded forests and deep, cold lakes. The endless canopy of pine and fir offered shelter and solitude, and the rhythm of their lives began to sync with the turning of the seasons. They learned to read the subtle signs in the behavior of animals and the growth of moss on trees. Their whispers became prayers to the spirits of the forest, their fluid gestures evolving into a rich, silent language for tracking game through the silent woods. They built their dwellings not from sun-baked brick, but from the very trees that sheltered them, crafting longhouses from logs and weaving roofs from reeds, their architecture a testament to their harmony with the untamed world. Their customs grew from necessity, stories told around crackling fires of how the world was born from a great frost, and rituals to honor the mighty stag whose sacrifice ensured their winter survival. To the south, another group, whose communication was a melodic, sing-song dialect full of rising and falling tones, journeyed until the air grew hot and dry, and the earth revealed veins of bright copper and glinting stones. They settled in a rugged landscape of mesas and canyons, where the sun was a relentless, defining presence. Their language, so suited to carrying across open spaces, became a tool for coordinating the arduous work of quarrying and building. They learned to channel the rare, precious rains, constructing intricate systems of canals and reservoirs that turned the desert's edge into a ribbon of green. Their homes were carved into the very faces of the cliffs or built from the stones they pried from the earth, creating sprawling terraced cities that seemed to grow organically from the rock. Their songs became legends of a great flood that had once cleansed the world, and their dances mimicked the movements of the scorpion and the hawk. Animals that thrived in the harsh, beautiful land they now called their own. Far to the west, a tribe that spoke in rhythmic, percussive bursts of sound followed the setting sun until they reached a vast, rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon, an ocean of wind-rippled grass under an immense bowl of sky. Here they found herds of swift, shaggy creatures, and their lives became intertwined with the great migrations. Their language, sharp and direct, was perfect for commands shouted across distances, for coordinating the dangerous hunt, for the swift exchange of information about weather and predators. They did not build cities of stone or wood, but learned to live with the land, following the herds in a perpetual nomadic cycle. Their homes were portable structures of hide and pole, easily assembled and disassembled, their entire culture packed onto the backs of sturdy, domesticated beasts. Their stories were not of fixed places, but of journeys, of ancestral spirits who rode the wind, and their most sacred customs involved the honoring of the great beasts that provided them with food, clothing, and their very identity. And so the world was remade. The single, unified tapestry of Babel was torn into 1,000 distinct pieces, each group weaving its own unique pattern with the threads of their new language, their new environment, and their new isolated history. The shared dream of the tower was forgotten, replaced by a multitude of smaller, earthbound dreams. The common origin was blurred, transforming into 1,000 different creation myths. What had been one people became many, Their difference is no longer just of accent or custom, but of fundamental worldview. Their separate paths leading them to become strangers to each other, citizens of a world now irrevocably and tragically divided. Chapter 18. Echoes of the past years flowed like the river through the valley, carving deep channels in the land and in the lives of those who had settled there. Eli was no longer the boy who had fled the crumbling city. He was a man whose face was etched with the lines of sun and sorrow, his hands permanently shaped by the tools of survival. The settlement had grown from a desperate camp into a thriving village, its fields fertile, its homes sturdy. The harsh, guttural tongue of his people was no longer alien to him. It was the language of his children's laughter, the medium of daily life, the sound of home. Yet the past was a persistent ghost, whispering at the edges of his consciousness, especially when travelers came. They arrived sporadically, small bands of dusty, weary men and women from distant, newly formed tribes, drawn to the valley by rumors of water and trade. They would sit around the communal fire in the evening, their strange languages a jarring counterpoint to the familiar sounds of the village. Eli would always find a place to sit nearby, listening intently, not for the meaning of their words, but for the stories they carried, the fragmented, distorted echoes of the world he had lost. They spoke of the great scattering, of the curse that had fallen from the sky, but the details were always wrong, the truth worn smooth and featureless by the relentless river of time and retelling. One traveler, a man with eyes the color of a winter sky and a language full of soft, rounded vowels, spoke of the tower not as a work of ambition, but as a fortress built by a mad king to wage war on the gods themselves. In his version, the stones were not laid with hope, but with the crack of whips, and the confusion was a divine punishment for cruelty, not pride. Another, a woman from a southern tribe whose speech clicked and popped like fire, described it as a beautiful, spiraling tree of crystal that had reflected the entire world until it grew too proud and shattered, its fragments becoming the many languages of the earth. She spoke of it with a kind of wistful reverence, a lost wonder, not a folly. A third, from the western plains, spun a tale of a mountain they had tried to move, not a tower they had tried to build. And the great noise that had erupted was the mountain itself laughing at their hubris, its laughter splintering their single tongue into 1,000 pieces. Eli listened to these tales, his own memories, vivid and sharp with the pain of personal loss, clashing violently with the romanticized, muddled myths. They had not been slaves or madmen. They had been friends and families united by a dream. The tower was not crystal or a mountain. It was limestone and mortar, dust and sweat and blistered hands. Maya was not a character in a legend. She was a real girl with a quiet voice and worried eyes, whose absence was a hollow space in his life that no story could ever fill. He wanted to stand and shout his own truth, to describe the specific weight of a trowel, the sound of Zara's voice ringing across the plaza, the exact shade of fear in Maya's face on the high ledge. But the words were trapped. His truth was locked in a language that was dead to the world, a private relic. The magnificent, terrible personal reality of Babel was being smoothed into a collection of harmless, contradictory fables, its sharp edges worn away, its profound tragedy diluted into mere folklore. The memory was fading, not because people had forgotten, but because they had begun to remember it differently, and in that difference The truth of what they had lost was disappearing forever. Chapter 19. The Price. We paid. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like a cluster of fallen stars in the deep quiet of the valley's night. Eli sat apart from the circle, the familiar guttural sounds of his people's evening conversations a soft murmur against the backdrop of chirping crickets. He was an old man now, the weight of years a tangible presence in the ache of his joints, and the silver threading his beard. The village around him slept, a testament to resilience, a community forged from the crucible of chaos, but tonight the peace of his hard-won home could not quiet the ghosts that the travelers' tales had stirred. Their distorted myths of Babel were like clumsy hands fumbling with a delicate, precious artifact, and the act had broken something open inside him, releasing a flood of unvarnished memory. He looked at the solid, earth-bound dwellings, the carefully tended fields, the sleeping forms of his children and grandchildren, and he saw not just a village, but the exorbitant price tag on its existence. His mind journeyed back, not to the glorious ceremonies or the dizzying heights, but to the fractures that had begun long before the sky spoke its devastating sentence. He saw the first small arguments over building techniques, the way a shared vision had splintered into stubborn factions. He felt again the cold knot in his stomach after his fight with Maya, the moment he had chosen the intoxicating lure of the summit over the steady anchor of friendship. That single, personal failure now seemed a microcosm of their collective sin. Their ambition had not been a pure, unified force. It had been a hungry fire that consumed everything in its path, starting with the subtle bonds of trust and patience. The divine confusion had not created their divisions. It had merely given voice to the silent ones that were already there, amplifying them into a world-shattering cacophony. They had been so focused on the stones they were stacking heavenward that they had failed to notice the foundations of their own humanity crumbling beneath their feet. The world they lived in now was the direct, bitter harvest of that neglect. The conflict over water, the wary suspicion of strangers, the impossibility of true understanding between tribes, these were not random misfortunes. They were the legacy of Babel, the perpetual echoing consequence of a friendship broken on a high ledge, of a community that prized a monument over its own members. The tower was gone, a pile of rubble being reclaimed by the desert, but the conflicts it had ignited were now woven into the very fabric of human existence. Every new nation, with its own language and customs, was a monument to that initial catastrophic failure to listen, to yield, to cherish the connection more than the achievement. The price they had paid was not just a lost city or a shattered dream. It was a world forever after haunted by the ghost of what they had once been, a world where every misunderstanding was a fresh echo of that first great misunderstanding, and every lonely heart carried the faint, terrible memory of a unity that had been sacrificed for a spire of stone. Chapter 20. A World of Nations. The scattered seeds of Babel had taken root, not as a single unified forest, but as a vast, tangled wilderness of distinct and separate groves. The tentative groups that had once huddled around shared water sources, bound only by the accident of a common new tongue, had solidified over the passing years into nations. These were no longer mere bands of survivors. They were societies with their own names, their own chieftains who had become kings, their own customs codified into law. The harsh, guttural language of Eli's people was now the official tongue of the Valley of Stone, its rhythms and rules taught deliberately to wide-eyed children who knew no other world. Their leader, the same man who had first organized their flight and their building, now sat on a carved wooden chair in the village's central longhouse, his authority unquestioned, his word governing disputes over property and harvests. Similar scenes played out in the northern forests, the southern canyons, and the western plains, leaders emerging from the crucible of survival to wield power over a people defined by their shared, exclusive language. With this solidification of identity came the inevitable friction of proximity. The world, once vast and empty, began to feel cramped. The Valley of Stone was rich, but its western border was a range of hills that another tribe, the Sun Singers with their melodic language, now claimed as their ancestral hunting grounds. A dispute that began with a missing goat escalated into a tense standoff between armed hunting parties. There were no shared words for negotiation, no common ground for compromise. Gestures that were meant to indicate a boundary line were interpreted as threats. A shouted warning from one side was heard as a war cry by the other. The conflict was not born of deep-seated hatred, but of a simple, irreconcilable difference in perception, a direct echo of the divine confusion that had spawned them. The land itself became a symbol of their separation, a prize to be defended not for its value, but because the other wanted it. The resources that had once been shared freely in the city of unity were now causes for silent, simmering wars. A fertile stretch of land between two rivers was claimed by 3 different tribes, each with a creation myth that placed their god's blessing specifically upon that soil. A rich deposit of flint, essential for tools and weapons, lay in a contested pass. The arguments were no longer about building techniques, as they had been at the tower's base, but about survival and supremacy in a world of limited means. The leaders, who should have been shepherds of their people, became generals by necessity, their councils filled with talk of stockpiles and defensive positions. The memory of a time when a single word could unite 10,000 hands to a single task was a fading, almost unbelievable dream. Now, a single misunderstood gesture could send 100 men to their deaths. The nations stood shoulder to shoulder across invisible, fiercely guarded borders, their distinct languages not just a barrier to communication, but the very foundation of the suspicion and conflict that defined their new, divided world, a perpetual and painful echo of the silence that had fallen at Babel. Chapter 21. Trying to understand the hunger was a hollow, insistent drumbeat in the belly of the Valley of Stone, a stark reminder that survival was a fragile bargain with the land. The late summer harvest had been meager, the grains thin and the tubers small, leaving the storehouses alarmingly bare as the first chill of autumn whispered through the valley. The council of elders, their faces grim in the firelight, had spoken of a neighboring tribe to the south, the river people, who were rumored to have reaped a bounty from the fertile banks of the great waterway. Trade was the only answer, but trade required a common tongue, a bridge of understanding that had been burned to ashes at Babel. A desperate, fragile hope settled on Eli. He was one of the few who had shown any aptitude for picking up the cadences of other tongues during their travels, his ear attuned to patterns where others heard only noise. The task fell to him, a burden as heavy as any stone he had ever lifted. He was to travel to the river people and attempt to barter for grain, armed not with weapons, but with a handful of carefully practiced words and a heart full of trepidation. The journey south was a quiet, solitary trek. The landscape changed gradually, the rugged hills of his home giving way to gentler, water-kissed slopes. When he finally crested the last ridge and saw the settlement of the river people sprawled along the wide, lazy river, his breath caught. It was a different world. Their dwellings were not of wood and stone, but of woven reeds and bundled grasses rising on stilts above the marshy ground. Canoes, sleek and silent, glided across the water. The air hummed with the sound of their language, a fluid melodic current of rising and falling tones that flowed as smoothly as the river itself. It was beautiful and utterly impenetrable. Eli approached the edge of their village with his hands open and empty, his posture deliberately non-threatening. A small group of men and women emerged from one of the reed huts, their expressions not hostile, but deeply wary. They watched him, their eyes noting his different clothing, the set of his shoulders, the foreignness of his very presence. Eli took a deep breath, the practiced phrases feeling like clumsy stones in his mouth. He pointed to himself, then back in the direction of his valley. He then held out a small, finely worked stone blade, a valuable tool from his people's stores, and pointed toward their stacked baskets of golden grain. He spoke the words he had painstakingly rehearsed, the sounds that his people believed meant trade and food. The syllables felt alien and awkward on his tongue, a crude imitation of their music. For a moment, there was only the sound of the river and the distant cry of a water bird. Then one of the river people, a man with a weathered face and intelligent eyes, stepped forward. He replied, his voice a gentle, questioning cascade of sound. He pointed not at the grain, but at the river, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the sky. He repeated a single melodic word, his tone patient, as if explaining something simple to a child. A cold knot of frustration tightened in Eli's stomach. He had not been understood, or worse, he had been misunderstood. He tried again, his voice rising slightly with desperation, emphasizing the stone blade, then pointing more insistently at the grain. The man's expression shifted from patience to confusion, then to a flicker of irritation. He shook his head and spoke again, this time more firmly, pointing emphatically at the river. He seemed to be asking a question about water or fishing or the weather, things that had nothing to do with Eli's gnawing hunger. The other river people began to murmur amongst themselves, their melodic language now sounding like a wall of polite but firm resistance. Eli's carefully constructed bridge of words had collapsed before a single stone could cross. He stood there, the valuable blade feeling foolish and useless in his hand, the gulf between their worlds as wide and unbridgeable as the river itself. The frustration was a hot, bitter taste in his throat. He had come in peace, with a simple, honest need, and had been defeated not by malice, but by the tragic, irreversible poetry of a language he could not speak. Chapter 22. The Friend I Lost. The memory of Maya was a ghost that walked with Eli through every season, a persistent presence more real to him than the solid earthbound world he had helped build. In the quiet moments, while tending the fledgling crops, sitting by the evening fire, or watching his own children play their wordless games of chase, his mind would slip its tether to the present and drift back to the sun-drenched days of the City of Unity. He saw her not as a blurred figure from a half-remembered myth, but in perfect, painful clarity. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the specific pattern of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the quiet, intent look in her eyes when she listened to the world around her. He remembered the weight of her hand in his as they ran through the dusty streets, the sound of her laughter mingling with his own, a private music that had been the soundtrack of his childhood. These memories were not stories. They were wounds, tender to the touch, and they had not faded with the passing years. If anything, the stability of his new life only made the loss of her feel more acute, a single dissonant note in an otherwise harmonious existence. His greatest regret was not the tower, nor the divine confusion, nor the scattering of the peoples. Those were grand, catastrophic events that felt almost mythical in their scale, the acts of gods or fate. His regret was small, personal, and entirely his own. It was the memory of their last conversation on the high, windy ledge. He could still feel the intoxicating thrill of the altitude, the impatience that had made him dismiss her fears as trivial. He saw the hurt in her eyes, the way the light in them had dimmed when he turned away from her concern and back toward the cold, seductive stone. He had chosen the collective dream over the individual heart, and in that single, selfish moment, he had broken the most precious thing he possessed. He often tortured himself with fantasies of a different choice, of him listening, of him climbing down with her, of them facing whatever was to come together. In those daydreams, they were not separated by the chaos. They were holding on to each other, a single point of understanding in the maelstrom. But reality was a cruel, unyielding truth. He had let her walk away, and he had never seen her again. He found himself searching for her in the faces of every stranger who passed through the valley, in every tale told by travelers from distant tribes. He would study the women from the northern forests or the southern canyons, looking for a familiar curve of a cheek or a particular way of holding the head. It was a futile hope, he knew. The world was vast now, and she was a single soul lost in its immensity. Was she safe? Had she found a group that cherished her quiet wisdom? Was she, somewhere under this same sky, a mother telling her own children stories of a lost city and a lost friend? Or had the chaos been too much for her gentle spirit? The not knowing was a special kind of torment. His life in the valley was full of work, of family, of purpose, but it was a life lived in a house that always felt like it was missing its foundational stone. He had a new language, a new home, a new people, but the friend of his heart was gone, and with her, the last true echo of the boy he had once been. He would look up at the stars, those cold, distant points of light they had once dreamed of touching, and send a silent, hopeless wish into the vast, silent night. A wish not for unity or understanding, but for a single, simple thing, to know that she was happy, and to somehow let her know that he was sorry. Chapter 23. New generations, Eli's children, knew the world only as a place of defined borders and distinct sounds. To them, the Valley of Stone was not a refuge carved from chaos, but the entire universe, its familiar guttural language, the natural music of existence. They played games along the riverbank, their shouts echoing the sharp, commanding tones of their elders, never knowing that those very sounds had once been a curse torn from their father's throat. They learned the names of the crops they helped tend, the paths through the wooded hills, the stories of the first hunts, and the building of the longhouses, stories that began with their arrival in the valley, as if their people had sprung fully formed from its fertile soil. The world before the scattering was a hazy, almost mythical time, a vague age of before that held no more weight for them than a tale of giants or water spirits. Their identity was rooted in the here and now, in the solidity of their village and the exclusivity of their tongue. It was his youngest daughter, Leora, who first asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for years. They were sitting outside their dwelling at dusk, the sky a soft tapestry of violet and rose. Leora, her small fingers tracing the intricate grain of the wooden wall, looked up at her father, her eyes wide with a child's uncomplicated curiosity. She pointed a stubby finger toward the western hills, the direction from which all their foundational stories began. She used the word they had for things ancient and half-remembered, a word that meant old time. And then she formed the shape of a spire with her hands, stacking one small fist on top of the other, higher and higher, until her arms could reach no further. Her question was simple, her new language giving it a blunt, direct quality. Why did the people of the old time build the tall thing so high? The question landed in Eli's heart with the force of a physical blow. He looked at his daughter's innocent, expectant face, and for a moment he was speechless. How could he explain the intoxicating fever of a shared dream? How could he describe the feeling of a single, harmonious language that made 10,000 individuals feel like one beating heart? The words he needed were ghosts, trapped in a dead tongue. He could give her the facts, the ambition, the pride, the divine punishment, but those were just the bones of the story, stripped of the flesh and blood of its truth. He could not convey the specific golden light of those lost afternoons, the scent of hope that had perfumed the air, or the profound soul-crushing silence that had followed the cacophony. He could not explain the personal cost, the weight of a broken friendship that was for him the true legacy of the tower. He opened his mouth, the familiar harsh syllables of his adopted language feeling like a cage. He began to speak, his voice a low rumble. He told her of a city where everyone understood each other, a feat so simple and magnificent that his children could not even conceive of it. He spoke of a leader with a voice like fire, who painted a picture of the heavens within their grasp. He described the work, the dust, the soaring pride as the stones climbed toward the clouds. But when he reached the heart of the matter, the why, his words faltered. He could not articulate the fragile, beautiful arrogance of it all, the human need to touch the infinite, to leave a mark on the cosmos. He could only say they wanted to see what was there, an explanation as flat and unsatisfying as the plains they had crossed. He saw the understanding in her eyes remain partial, a child's acceptance of a fable. She had the shape of the story, but not its soul. Eli fell silent, the full weight of the history pressing down on him, a burden he carried alone. His children would inherit a world of many languages and many nations, but they would never truly inherit the story of Babel, for its deepest truths were locked away in the heart of a man who could no longer speak the language of his own memories. Chapter 24. The Brutal Truth. The years had carved their passage not just upon the land, but upon Eli himself, etching the story of survival into the lines of his face and the stoop of his shoulders. He stood at the edge of the village, his gaze sweeping across the tranquil, ordered life of the valley of stone, the smoke curling from hearths, the distant figures tending the fields, the laughter of his grandchildren carrying on the crisp air. It was a scene of hard-won peace, a testament to resilience. Yet on this quiet afternoon, the familiar satisfaction was absent, replaced by a cold, clarifying clarity that settled deep in his bones. The fragmented tales of travelers, the ghost of Maya's face, the daily struggles with neighboring tribes, all of it coalesced into a single, brutal truth that stripped away the last vestiges of comforting myth. For so long he had thought of the tower's collapse in terms of stone and mortar, a physical structure felled by a divine wind. But now he saw that the real collapse had been invisible, a disintegration that began long before the sky roared. The stones had not fallen. They had been pushed apart by the silent accumulating weight of broken humanity. He saw it clearly now. The ambition that had curdled into pride, the unity that had fractured into stubborn factions, the friendship he had sacrificed on the altar of a collective dream. The divine confusion had not been the cause of their downfall, but the final, devastating symptom. It was the universe holding up a mirror to the discord they had already nurtured in their own hearts. The true tower that had fallen was not the one of limestone reaching for the clouds, but the invisible one built from trust, patience, and the simple, profound act of listening. Its collapse was not a single cataclysmic event, but a slow-motion shattering that started with a dismissive gesture on a high ledge and ended with a world of strangers shouting in 1,000 different tongues. The legacy of Babel was not the cursed rubble of a monument, but the living, breathing reality of the world around him. Every border dispute, every failed trade, every wary glance exchanged with a stranger from a different tribe, these were not separate problems. They were the perpetual aftershocks of that initial spiritual collapse. The lost ambitions were not for touching the stars, but for the simpler, more profound goal of understanding the person standing beside you. The friendships that had divided people forever were not casualties of the chaos. They were its very foundation. He had spent a lifetime building a new home, raising a family, learning a new language, all in an attempt to outrun the memory of that day. But he realized now that he had been carrying the ruins of the tower within him all along. The brutal truth was that they had not been punished for building too high. They had been revealed for what they had become. The world was not divided because the languages were confused. The languages were confused because their hearts had already been divided, and the stones that fell were merely the echo of a humanity that had already broken itself. Chapter 25. A Glimmer of Hope. The afternoon sun cast long golden fingers across the valley, warming the packed earth of the village center where the children played. Eli, his movements slow and deliberate with the weight of many seasons, settled onto his familiar bench, its wood smoothed by years of use. His gaze, often turned inward to the landscapes of memory, was drawn outward by the sound of youthful exuberance. His own grandchildren, Leora's bright-eyed boy and girl, were engaged in a game of chase with two children from a small visiting trader party. that had arrived from the northern forests. The visitor's language was a soft, sibilant whisper, a stream of sound completely foreign to the guttural tongue of the Valley of Stone. Yet, on the dusty ground between the dwellings, language was irrelevant. He watched, his breath catching slightly in his chest, as his grandson Cale tried to explain the rules of their game. When his words were met with blank, polite stares from the northern children, Cale did not retreat in frustration. Instead, he grinned, a flash of white in his sun-browned face, and began to act it out. He mimed hiding behind a rain barrel, then leaping out with a silent, exaggerated roar. He pointed to a line scratched in the dirt, then to himself, then to the other children, his gestures clear and universal. The northern boy watched, his head tilted, then his own face broke into a smile of understanding. He nodded vigorously, a series of soft, whispering sounds falling from his lips that were clearly an affirmation. He then mimed a new action, a high, leaping jump, and pointed questioningly at Cale. Leora's daughter, seeing the exchange, clapped her hands and nodded, then demonstrated the jump herself. In moments, they had forged a new hybrid set of rules, a game born not from shared words, but from shared intention. Their communication a fluid dance of gesture, expression, and mimed action. A feeling stirred in Eli's chest, a sensation so long dormant he barely recognized it. It was not the fierce, burning pride of the tower, nor the grim satisfaction of survival. It was something quieter, gentler, yet infinitely more powerful. It was a fragile, tentative warmth, a glimmer in the profound darkness that had followed the scattering. He saw in these children, who knew only a world of division, the innate, untaught desire to connect. They had not been told to bridge the gap. They had simply started building using the oldest tools humanity possessed, a smile, a pointing finger, an open hand. They were finding a way, not around the curse of Babel, but through it, discovering a common language written in the universal grammar of play. He thought of his own failed attempt to trade with the river people, the wall of sound that had defeated him. He thought of the arguments over water, the suspicion in the eyes of strangers, the weight of a lifetime of misunderstandings. But here, in the dust of the village square, was a different truth. The children were not burdened by the history of the tower. They were writing a new one. They were proving that the human spirit, though it could be fractured, could not be entirely silenced. The hope that bloomed in Eli's heart was not for a return to the old unity, a single tongue spoken by all. That dream was gone, its tomb the crumbling stones of a forgotten ambition. This new hope was for something more resilient, a world where people, despite their different songs, could still learn to dance to the same rhythm. He watched his granddaughter take the hand of the northern girl, leading her toward the river bank, their silent communion more eloquent than any speech. And for the first time in decades, Eli felt not the crushing weight of what was lost, but the delicate, soaring possibility of what might one day be found again.